Hi, my name is Tony Allison. I'm an Eagle Scout, having received my Eagle in my senior year of high school in 1989 in Dodge City, Kansas with Troop 168. I'm here with you today to share a little bit of information about the tote and chip, specifically about the use of camp saws. It is the proper tool for most outdoor wood cutting, receiving the second most use by a scout outside of the pocket knife. Really, there's two types of camp saws. First off, we have a folding saw, such as this model Fiskars here. The components of this saw are the handle, the cutting blade, and then on the back side here there is a release that allows for the closure and opening of the saw. Operates very much like a pocket knife, actually. The second type of camp saw is the bow saw, probably the most widely used. It's probably my favorite, what I grew up using the most. The components of this are the frame, the blade, the handle, and then also the silver metal device, which is the tensioner. And that can be accessed to either increase or decrease the tension of the blade, or to remove the blade and for replacement. As far as care and maintenance, you always want to store your saws, no matter which type, in a safe, dry location. And you want to store it away from the public or from people when it's not in use. You always want to maintain a sharp blade with proper tension. You want to avoid grounding the saw, which can cause dullness or could potentially cause rust. And that means when you're grounding the saw, that means you're working in a downward motion. You're driving the saw into the ground or to the soil, something that you want to avoid. So you always want to try and keep your blade free of sawdust, dirt, and rust. Just kind of some of the general safety rules of a saw. The importance of always wearing, proper safety gloves. Eye protection is absolutely mandatory when using a saw like this. I actually wear glasses, but it's still always a good idea to put some tempered safety glasses on over the top when you're utilizing a saw. Some other things for consideration on safety. Today I'm wearing jeans, and by the way, the reason that we're indoors today, this is South Central Kansas. We're filming this video in late February, and it's actually a little bit cold outside, but the wind's blowing about 45 miles an hour, so there wasn't any way possible to film this outside. But going back to safety consideration, jeans. Obviously, there's times of the year where it's not comfortable to wear jeans, but the denim does allow for some additional protection whenever you're utilizing, a saw or an axe or a pocket knife, whatever it might be. Just provides a little bit of an added layer. You always want to wear adequate or proper boots when utilizing a saw. Might have seen better days. These are some old steel-toe boots, work boots that I use typically when I'm outside in nature and I'm using a saw again. Just that leather provides an added layer of protection. One of the things you probably want to avoid when utilizing a saw is baggy clothes, necklaces, anything that might bind or get in the way of that motion when you're utilizing the saw. Remember, safety first and safety always. Being safe is your responsibility. Your actions can affect others. Just a couple of tips when cutting down firewood, such as this that is sitting on the block in front of me here today. You always want to brace the wood on a chopping block, a sawhorse, or a solid support. When you're out in nature, it's typically going to be tree stumps or cut lumber, something along that. Something that's very secure, safe, sturdy, going to support the weight of the wood. Whenever you're cutting down the firewood, you want to try and use as much of a horizontal motion as possible and use long, sustained cuts across the wood. And I would always start by scoring your lumber if possible, and you can do that by simply, kind of taking an outward motion away from your body and scoring several times to kind of create that gouge in there that will then allow for those sustained cuts to be a lot easier. So, you think about, the strokes of the saw. A lot of times people want to use those short, really fast strokes and utilizing a saw, but that actually does a couple of things. One, it actually takes a lot more time to cut through stock. And secondly, if you're doing that, what you're actually doing is by doing so, you're only using about 6 or so inches of the saw. And what you're going to do is you're going to dull that middle important 6 or so inches of the saw while the edges remain unused. So again, long, sustained, smooth strokes. I would also just, another thing to keep in mind is to allow the weight of the saw to kind of pull the blade through. You don't have to be really aggressive, in cutting wood. You're simply allowing the weight of the saw and your, just a little bit of strength behind it, but allow the weight of the saw to pull and push the blade. Just a couple of tips when cutting standing wood. You never want to cut from a standing tree, dead or alive, without the permission, the ranger, the property owner, the manager, your scoutmaster. And we can utilize this same piece of lumber here for this purpose. But if you're ever cutting limbs, off of an existing tree, you always want to make an undercut from the bottom of the branch down here, parallel to the rest of the tree. And then when you're ready to actually cut it off, you want to cut down from the top. And what that does is it protects the trunk from further damage. A lot of times that if you don't make that undercut, as you cut through the bark, it will actually break off potentially at the bottom and then can strip or damage the bark, which can lead to further future damage or potentially even death of the tree at some point. One thing to keep in mind on standing wood also, when you are cutting or clearing saplings, you want to cut as close to the ground as possible without grounding the saw. Again, you're basically going to be in a cutting motion just right above ground level, working the saw. But again, you don't want to drive that at an angle where you're driving your saw down into the ground. So keep that in mind. A couple of the do nots for camp saws. You don't want to cut any trees, alive or dead, without permission. Don't allow the saw's blade to cut into the ground. The soil and rocks over time, they're going to dull your blade. They're going to promote rust. You don't ever want to leave a saw laying around camp. Some of the do's with respect to camp saws, you want to keep the saw sheathed when not in use. And a lot of these saws today, they'll come with a plastic sheathing that's really difficult to get back on the saw. And what my recommendation with that is you take a piece of hose, maybe an old piece of hose that's no longer being used, and if you cut that the length of your saw blade, and of course cutting off the hose ends there, but if you cut that to the length of your saw blade and then make a cut the entire length of the hose and then kind of pry it open a little bit, then you've just created a great sheath for your saw in the future. Again, just a little tip to keep in mind. Some of the other do's, you do want to carry a saw with the blade away from your body. On an open saw like this, again, whenever possible, you always want to put a sheath on it if possible when you're transporting the saw. But if you have to carry a saw without a sheath, then what you want to do is carry the saw with the blade pointing outside. The benefit of that is that if you fall, then you're basically just going to put the blade and the entire saw horizontal on the ground. If you're carrying it in downward motion, which is probably the second best way to carry it, the problem with that is that if you trip and or stumble, you're going to drive that saw into the ground, and you're probably going to potentially break the frame, maybe even the blade. So again, just something to keep in mind. Again, carry the saw with the blade away from your body. You do want to replace the saw blades when they become dull. Sharp saws are always easier to use, easier to control than any dull saw. You always want to use care when passing a saw to another person. Always turn the saw blade away from both persons. Use the same "may I," "thank you," and "you're welcome" rules as when passing a pocket knife or other instruments. You do always want to wear gloves, like I have on today. You always want to wear eye protection again, as I mentioned earlier. You want to establish a defined cutting area with tape or bright colored rope whenever it's possible. Something like yellow or something that easily identifies that is a identified area, for cutting with axes, blades, of any type. So when that is not possible, or even when there is a defined cutting area, you always want to create a blood zone or a safety zone. And basically, I can kind of illustrate that, and what that means is that it's a perimeter around you in which an accident could occur that you need people or objects to be free of. And we can establish that by the length of our arm plus the length of our saw. And in this instance, for me, it's going to be about an 8-foot perimeter. And I can check my area by rotating away from the blade edge, like this, for example. You can go in an entire circle. What you want to make sure is that there are no persons, no trees, no obstructions of any type within that blood area or safety zone where an accident could occur. One thing to keep in mind with a defined cutting area is to always ask permission to enter those areas, particularly when they're in use by others. I think that by following these tips I've given today, coupled with hands-on experience with your trainers, other scouts, you'll be well on your way to the tote and chip and safe use of the camper saw. Hope this was beneficial today, guys. Great luck. Thank you.